A black CEO was denied a first-class seat. 6 minutes later, he fired the flight attendant. That sentence is the headline that exploded across feeds, but it needs an immediate correction. He did not physically fire anyone at the gate. What happened in those minutes was something sharper and more modern. Evidence captured on phones and a pre-existing corporate contract with teeth turned a humiliating encounter into a moment of organizational accountability. The confrontation in the cabin set in motion a chain of events: a live audit, a frantic corporate conference call, and an ultimatum grounded in contract language that forced immediate disciplinary action and the beginning of structural change. The airplane door closed. The cabin lights were dimmed to a soft amber. The engines were a steady, distant roar. Seats in the first-class cabin reclined like polite, expectant animals. For most passengers, this part of the flight would be an unremarkable stretch of minutes: reading a book, answering a text, watching the safety demonstration. For Marcus Williams, the next 6 minutes would be anything but routine. Marcus walked down the narrow aisle with a calm that came from practice. He was dressed plainly: dark jeans, a blazer that had seen better boardrooms, a pressed shirt. He had just finished a consulting engagement the week before and had been traveling between clients. There was a corporate badge on his lapel that read Williams Aviation Consulting, a small polished metal token that matched the quiet authority in his stride. He was a man used to contracts and clauses, to risk matrices and maintenance schedules. He knew how to read the fine print and how to use it. He took his assigned first-class seat, placed a small leather bag beneath the overhead bin, and reached for his phone to close an email. That is when the interruption came. Jennifer Morrison, the lead flight attendant on duty, stepped forward and blocked him with a practiced firmness. Her voice held the casual certainty of someone used to being the steward of the cabin. "Sir, this is first class," she said. Marcus looked at his boarding pass, then at her. He slid the ticket across his seat armrest, digital boarding pass shimmering on his phone, matching the name assigned to 2A. There was a flicker of confusion on her face. The cabin hummed with the minor ripple of a small scene breaking into the open. "You'll have to move back," Morrison said, voice clearer now, in a manner that made other passengers glance up from their screens. "First class is for people with a different ticket." There are many ways to be told you are in the wrong place. Sometimes it's a ticketing error. Sometimes it's a misunderstanding of names or flight classes. Sometimes it is prejudice weaving itself into a casual refusal. This moment carried something else, a dismissal that felt less like a mistake and more like an assumption. Around them, phones emerged.
Sarah Chen, a passenger in the center block of first class, tilted her phone and began an Instagram Live. The teenage girl in the coach section, 2 rows back but close to the action, lifted her phone. The little blue light of her screen illuminated her face. Within seconds, the cabin's hush turned into a chorus of small recording noises: shudders, the low whisper of, "Is she serious?" and a mounting electric tension that comes when a private wrong is being made public. Marcus kept his tone even. He showed his ID, smiled without warmth. "This is my seat," he said. "I've checked in. My boarding pass is valid." Morrison repeated her refusal. Her words were firm. "You'll have to move back." But there was a quality to them that felt calibrated, a line delivered precisely because it had not been tested before. When Marcus produced the corporate ID and the Centurion card that sometimes opens doors, she still hesitated to accept them as proof. Other passengers began to murmur. A mother clutched the armrest beside her child. A business traveler adjusted his headphones, as if to eavesdrop on a different kind of meeting than the one for which he'd packed his laptop. Time on flights is a different currency. Minutes to take off are measured against gate crews, fuel loads, crew hours. That clock was ticking now, puffing a small, steady pressure into the cabin. Check-in, doors closed, engines up. A captain's announcement could come at any moment. Every second increased the stakes. Missed connections, angry passengers, and the rare but real operational dominoes that follow a delay. As phones stitched the scene into the internet, Marcus did something few passengers do in public humiliation. He did not raise his voice. He reached for a different language, the language of leverage. "I need to speak to Janet Rodriguez in corporate relations," he said, quiet and precise. He unlatched his laptop and opened a document. He read the contact out like a calm incantation. "Janet Rodriguez, corporate relations. Williams Aviation Consulting holds a maintenance contract active with your airline." There was a physical intake of breath, a small pause that suddenly felt enormous. The words maintenance contract in that cabin were a complicated kind of currency. They hinted not merely at purchasing power, but at operational interdependence. Maintenance contracts are, in many airlines,
the connective tissue that keeps aircraft safe and on schedule. Inspections, parts procurement, scheduled overhauls. They are negotiated with lawyers and executed with checklists. To hold such a contract is to have the company's equipment, and by extension its reputation, tied in part to your company's audits and oversight. Out in the cabin, Sarah Chen's live stream lit up. Viewers began to flood in. Comments scrolled. "What's going on? He has his boarding pass. Odd."
The teenage girl's video, uploaded later and then stitched into the live feed, showed a close-up of Morrison's face as she looked down at the boarding pass, then up at Marcus, then away. Marcus laid out the facts, calmly. The boarding pass was valid, his ID matched, he was a contracted auditor under a clause in the maintenance agreement that permitted spot checks of customer service attitudes as well as technical compliance, part of a broader service equity audit built into the partnership to ensure both mechanical safety and customer-facing fairness, a program Williams Aviation Consulting had piloted across several carriers. He explained in plain terms what an audit could trigger. Documentation of discriminatory interactions could be included in formal audit findings, and under the terms of the contract, certain remedial actions would follow. He placed the phone on the fold-down tray and clicked on a recorded list, plain headings, simple clauses translated into everyday language. Section 12C, he said, and then paraphrased. If a frontline employee engages in behavior that discriminates against passengers during an audit observation, the airline must investigate, and if such behavior is confirmed, it triggers mandatory retraining and potential disciplinary action. Section 15, he added, requires immediate remedial steps if a contracted auditor's documented findings show systemic issues. For passengers eavesdropping, the cabin had changed color. The hum of the engines felt suddenly like a drumming heartbeat. Morrison's posture moved from certainty to a visible constriction around her jaw. A supervisor, David Park, who had been checking the galley, stepped forward. Park's voice tried to lower the heat. "Ma'am, sir, let's step through this quietly. He's got a boarding pass. Let's not escalate." But the escalation had already left the private realm. The live stream, now measurable, ticked upward. Hundreds, then thousands of live viewers in a matter of minutes. The app's viewer counter, normally a slow crawl for an in-flight selfie, jumped into the low 5 figures as friends and strangers alike hit share. Comments piled up, outraged, incredulous, supportive. Many viewers in the early minute feed labeled the incident with a common tag, #SeatBelonging, almost instantly. The moment was no longer just an in-cabin misunderstanding. It was public, searchable, and recorded in the small, indisputable pixels of other people's phones. Marcus, by design, did something else. He called Janet Rodriguez. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He asked to confirm the corporate contact and to notify the company's contract compliance team that a spot audit had just begun. The phone call itself was a procedural step, exactly the sort of ordinary move that becomes extraordinary when recorded and broadcast in real time. Marcus explained that he was undertaking a spot audit that included a service equity assessment and that he had documentation of an interaction that might be relevant to the contract's performance clauses. On the other end of the line, a corporate inbox churned. Within minutes, a video clip from Sarah Chen's live stream, clipped and sent by other passengers, found its way to a Williams Aviation Consulting compliance manager. Janet Rodriguez was notified. She responded with a curt but focused line. "Get me a live feed and open a line to the airline's station manager." Marcus, still composed, expanded the call and typed in the names he had been trained to use: station manager Thomas Hart, supervisor David Park, and the airline's corporate relations desk. In a world of cascading information, few things escalate faster than the coincidence of authority and documentation. A CEO, Patricia Hayes, was not yet on the line, but the station manager, Hart, was. For the airline, a maintenance contract dispute was not merely a commercial annoyance. It raised regulatory eyebrows and potential reputational damage. Contracts that touch airplane maintenance can attract scrutiny from regulators who worry not only about mechanical safety, but also how airlines serve passengers fairly, a growing dimension of compliance in recent years. The captain, who had been running through pre-flight checks in the cockpit, received a terse message from the flight attendant. "We have a live incident, auditor present, passengers recording." The pilot's brow furrowed as he understood the operational consequences. He walked down from the flight deck, his shoes clicking on the narrow aisle, and asked quietly whether the situation would require a delay. The answer would determine whether the plane would leave on time and whether other passengers would miss connections. Meanwhile, the social media numbers continued to climb. Reported viewer counts began populating dashboards that monitor viral content. At one point, an app that aggregates live view data flashed a preliminary count, tens of thousands of live viewers within the first 6 minutes. Those numbers, labeled as reported by the service, were not yet verified in a formal audit, but they were visible to a nervous set of stakeholders watching through a different kind of window, corporate feeds.
Back in the cabin, passengers had polarized. Some watched with a kind of grim curiosity reserved for reality television. Others whispered about fairness and the humiliation they had witnessed. Marcus remained calm, measured. He spoke with a clarity that belonged to someone who has spent a career translating power into policy. "If this is an audit observation," he said, his voice low but audible, "I will document it. I will include video and timestamps. The contract requires us to file an incident report. That report obligates the airline to investigate." Morrison's face, for the first time, showed something like fear.
Not the fear of a sudden firing, she had not been promised one, but the fear of her actions being recorded, catalogued, and then analyzed by professionals whose job was to look for patterns. In that moment, the possibility of training, suspension, or other disciplinary steps became real. The difference between a private shame and an institutional consequence is the translation of behavior into documented evidence that appears in a ledger, in a report, in a corrective action plan. The station manager, Thomas Hart, approached the front of the cabin. His training kicked in. He tried to diffuse with professional scripts. "We can step through the passenger verification," he suggested, tone careful. "Let's check boarding information. Let's review the pass." Behind him, the captain's presence concretized. The authority of the flight deck is a material constraint on corporate choices. If the plane stays on the ground, the airline faces a cascade of operational costs, from gate fees to ripple effects on crews and connections. Marcus was procedural. He read a short, plain-language synopsis of the contract clauses relevant to the moment. No legalese, but the essence was clear. Audits could produce findings that required corrective measures. The airline, as a party to that contract, had to respond in defined windows of time. He offered to proceed with a formal documentation, and then, importantly, he placed his laptop open so that others could see what he was recording. Video from Sarah Chen's livestream and the teenage girl joined Marcus's documentation. The evidence became multi-source, not just a single perspective. That multi-source quality matters. Footage from different angles and different devices reduces the possibility of a single biased interpretation. In the event of a dispute, a company cannot easily claim misunderstanding if multiple independent devices show the same sequence of actions. Marcus understood that. This was not mere retaliation, but an institutionalized test of whether a frontline employee's behavior met the airline's standards. At this point, the cabin's mood had shifted from curiosity to a focused attention that felt almost juridical. People watched as if they were jurors, not tourists. The airline's regional office had been notified. On Marcus's screen, a conference bridge began to populate. Names flickered onto the call. Janet Rodriguez of Williams Aviation Consulting, Thomas Hart, Captain Rodriguez, David Park. A line for corporate relations was queued. An internal tactics message, constructed to be efficient and clear, appeared in a tiny chat window. Document, do not escalate physically, open investigation, notify station manager, notify corporate. The airline's executives, monitoring their feeds, began to triangulate the potential exposure.
Patricia Hayes, the airline's CEO, received a brief from her communications director. A red flag summary, 5 sentences that compressed the scene into a few urgent items. Live video circulating, a contracted auditor present, potential contractual triggers, a possible operational delay. Her phone vibrated. The live view counters ticked on her tablet. In that instant, a CEO, more accustomed to quarterly calls and runway expansions, found herself confronted by a 6-minute event that could bleed into hours of headlines. Corporate decision-making in moments like this is a study in trade-offs. For an airline, the calculus includes legal risk, regulatory scrutiny, stockholder perception, and operational costs. Delay the plane and you inconvenience hundreds. Move forward and you risk a public backlash, compounded by the knowledge that the incident is recorded and circulating. For executives, the question is not only whom to discipline, but also what structural deficiencies this moment reveals. Training gaps, flawed verification procedures, perhaps an underlying culture that tolerates quick assumptions about who belongs in which space. A conference bridge was established, the sort of claustrophobic audio space that translates every syllable into consequential action. On one line, a corporate relations manager clarified the contract's basic mechanisms. On another, the station manager described the in-cabin interaction. Marcus offered timestamps and copies of the live recordings. The feed showed 3 angles: Marcus's phone, Sarah Chen's live, and the teenage girl's close-up of Morrison. Each camera offered a different perspective, together creating a fuller record. But the record was only as strong as the interpretation. The airline's spokespeople, cautious and trained for crisis, did not yet use the word discrimination in their internal summaries. The legal team sent a concise message through the bridge: collect all evidence, avoid public comment, do not admit liability, proceed with internal investigation.
The communications lead drafted a holding statement, respectful of passengers, apologetic in tone, promise of investigation, an all-purpose script. The PR machine began to whirl, and the rest of the world watched. Clips were shared across platforms. View counts were reported in banners that scroll up from the corner of feeds. Preliminary numbers in the tens of thousands, shares into the low thousands. Hashtags spun up like small storms. Seat belonging, equity on board, where do I belong? People typed quick judgments in comment fields. Others typed supportive messages for Marcus, for Morrison, for the airline. Some comments framed the moment as an episode in a larger pattern of discrimination. Others insisted on a more measured reading, asking for the full context. In the cabin, the captain made a pragmatic call.
Calculating the operational consequences, he decided to delay takeoff for a few minutes while the airline's station staff resolved whether the situation would affect passenger safety or the airline's exposure. Delays in aviation are expensive, measured in minutes and in a special kind of reputational currency. But the pause also gave space. It allowed the corporate bridge to mobilize and the compliance team to review the initial evidence. On the audio bridge, the name Patricia Hayes surfaced. The CEO, already briefed, asked a single pointed question through the stack of voices. What does the contract require here, in language we can act on now? The contract's compliance liaison, speaking calmly but quickly, summarized the relevant clauses in plainer terms. Documented discriminatory conduct observed during an audit triggers a formal investigation. If the observation is corroborated, the company is obliged to pursue corrective action, up to suspension and mandatory retraining, and to report the remediation plan within a defined window. For a moment, the conversation was purely mechanical. Clauses, obligations, timelines. That was by design. Corporate systems are built on protocols precisely to avoid turning a human, messy situation into subjective chaos. Marcus had engineered the moment to activate those systems. He had not shouted, "Fire her." He had simply provided the documentation that, under pre-agreed terms, required the airline to act. In the cabin, Morrison's composure had thinned. She had been a professional for years. Her instincts were service first. But the moment she realized her actions were being stitched into an audit, the realization was like a light, piercing fog. She stood at the galley doorway, shoulders slightly hunched, face flushed. A passenger who had filmed the exchange later described seeing the color drain from her face, like a stage light slowly dimming. David Park, the supervisor, offered a script. We can escort the passenger, review the documentation in the customer service desk, and proceed. It was the softest of compromises, a procedural move intended to de-escalate. But Marcus declined to be escorted. He wanted the interaction documented where it occurred, in context, in the first-class cabin, with the boarding pass and the timing intact. That insistence mattered. Many institutional reviews fail because the documenting party is displaced from the context. Marcus's insistence on context meant the evidence would capture not just the words, but the spatial and temporal contours of the event, the proximity of Morrison to passengers, the timing in relation to the scheduled departure, the sequence of responses as other employees intervened. It was a more robust kind of evidence than a simple complaint emailed after the fact. The conference bridge collected the facts and then built a short list of possible responses.
The airline could opt for the least public route, take the report, promise an investigation, and address the matter internally. It could, alternatively, act quickly, suspending the employee pending investigation and announcing a commitment to training. Quick action would pacify public outrage, but risk accusations of knee-jerk reaction. Delay could breed more leaks and inflame social platforms. Executives weighed the calculus in the compressed time of an incident that was both private and public. Sarah Chen's live feed ran in the background of the corporate bridge, tiny, shaky video showing a snapshot of Morrison's hand, Marcus's boarding pass, the tilt of passengers' heads. As the number of viewers continued to climb, the pressure on decision-makers increased. A holding statement drafted by communications hovered on Patricia Hayes' tablet. Legal cautioned about admissions. Compliance highlighted the contract's language that gave no room for ambiguous misunderstandings when the evidence came from multiple independent recordings. Then came the moment that would be replayed in many later summaries. Patricia Hayes, the airline CEO, leaned back in her chair and asked for a recommendation in plain terms. "Do we have grounds," she asked, "to suspend pending investigation based on the documented interaction and the contract triggers?" That question condensed the dilemma. It was not about instantaneous judgment of character. It was about whether the evidence, as presented, met the threshold defined in the company's own agreements and policies. It was the point where a private mistake could become a corporate precedent. It was 6 minutes after the initial denial, minutes that had felt like an eternity, and that had already altered the trajectory of several people's lives and the airline's public standing. In the cabin, passengers leaned forward, half expecting someone to stand and applaud. Instead, the sound was the soft ruffle of communication, the captain returning to his cockpit, the flight attendants resuming pre-flight checks with a visible but controlled change in demeanor. A murmur swept through those who had been watching. Some offered quiet sympathy to Morrison, others applauded Marcus's restraint. Marcus, for his part, remained composed. He had not sought humiliation for Morrison. His aim had been accountability within an institutional frame. He had long argued, both in published papers and in boardrooms, that systemic bias often hid behind procedural language and ambiguous contact points. Audits, he had written elsewhere, were only useful when they were paired with clear contractual consequences and transparent remediation pathways. Today, his audit program had performed its function. It had turned observation into enforceable documentation. As the corporate bridge continued to populate with voices, a new reality settled in. The airline's next move would not be made in the privacy of a single HR office.
This was now an incident whose ripples would be measured in social impressions and share metrics as much as in disciplinary memos. The cabin's initial flash of humiliation had transmuted into a tension between rapid organizational defense and the public's demand for accountability. And then, almost as an underscore to the moment's seriousness, the live view counter on Sarah Chen's feed broke a new line. The reported viewers climbed past a preliminary threshold, tens of thousands watching the same exchange at the same time. For a communications team, that number is not just symbolic. It is the metric that dictates posture, statements, timelines, named actions. The presence of so many watchers called for a proportional response. It was at this hinge, still within those opening minutes of the incident, but already pulled into the middle of a larger corporate apparatus, that the narrative tightened. The call in the corporate bridge reached a head. Voices became intercoms highlighting obligations and options. The station manager recommended immediate procedural steps. The legal representative recommended careful evidence preservation. Janet Rodriguez from Williams Aviation Consulting asked Marcus if he would submit the documented material for a formal audit report. Marcus agreed, and the file transfer began. But before any formal pronouncements could be made, the story paused, the way all live narratives do when the human and the institutional collide. Someone needed to make a decision. The cabin waited, still. The plane's hum was constant, but the human temperature had shifted. Passengers watched not only the action in front of them, but the imperceptible decisions being made in rooms far beyond the aircraft's metal shell. For Morrison, the arc of those minutes was a collapse toward a future she had not imagined. For Marcus, it was a confirmation of a method he had built through years of contract work, documentation plus leverage. For the airline, it was a problem that would require both immediate attention and longer-term structural responses. For bystanders and viewers, it was yet another instance of how the phone in the pocket has become a civic instrument, a means of converting private slights into public obligations. As the corporate bridge sorted options and the cabin prepared to give an update to passengers, the narrative had not yet resolved. The airline had not yet publicly committed to a course of action. No suspension had yet been announced over the public speakers. The clock to take off still ticked, and somewhere in a conference room a decision was coalescing. But the moment that would become the defining headline had already occurred. A black CEO had been denied a first-class seat, and within minutes, that denial had set loose a process that could not be easily put back in its box.
If there was one lesson embedded in the taut silence of the cabin and the busy chatter of conference bridges, it was this. The combination of real-time documentation and pre-negotiated contractual accountability changes the dynamics of everyday encounters. Small acts, once rendered visible and tied to enforceable obligations, produce consequences that travel far beyond the people in the moment. A few seats down, a woman who had been silent throughout the event whispered to her companion, "Do you think they'll actually do anything about it?" The woman next to her shook her head, part skeptical, part hopeful. That question about whether corporations will transform recorded outrage into real structural reform was the question now dangling in the air. The corporate bridge leaned toward a response. Materials were being assembled for an internal action memo that would recommend immediate interim measures pending a full investigation. Someone typed "suspend pending investigation" into a draft. Another flagged the need for sensitivity and the invocation of the contract. The social feeds continued to climb. The crew waited for instruction. The captain, moving between caution and schedule, checked his watch. And then, as the corporate machine poised itself to act, the narrative paused,
balanced on the hinge between reactive action and deliberate policy. The beginnings of an answer were forming on screens and in conference rooms, but the full arc of discipline, of remediation, of individual transformation, of industry-wide ripple effects was not yet complete. The next steps would determine whether this incident would be an isolated moment of accountability or a model for change. If viewers were watching, as tens of thousands were, they were left with a decision of their own, to document, to demand, to watch. The phones had already done some of the work. Now it was the organization's turn to do theirs. If you believe discrimination has no place in 2025, subscribe. This story matters. The decision came like a methodical clock check, not theatrical, but inevitable. On the corporate bridge, after the council, the legal caveats, and the contract liaison's plain language summary, the recommendation crystallized. The airline would suspend the lead flight attendant pending investigation, require a formal remedial program if the findings supported the audit, and publish a clear remediation plan within a defined window. It was a choice that balanced immediate accountability with process, not an instant public firing at the gate, but an activation of contractual remedy and operational discipline that moved quickly and publicly. In the cabin, the news landed with the same soft, irrevocable thump that decisions have when translated into action. Thomas Hart rose to the aisle with the procedural dignity of someone who knew how to carry difficult instructions. He addressed the passengers in a voice steady enough to be heard without adding heat.
We are pausing to ensure this matter is documented properly. We will follow our procedures and communicate next steps, he said, careful to avoid commentary that could inflame either side. Jennifer Morrison stood by the galley doorway, her uniform suddenly heavier than fabric. Her name tag felt like a ledger. She obeyed when Hart asked her to step aside for a moment while the company exercised its protocols. Suspension pending investigation is an administrative measure. It's not a moral sentence. Still, the humiliation was immediate and human. The flush in her cheeks, the way her hands found the back of a galley seat as if to steady an inner wobble, the way a professional's practiced calm thinned in plain sight. David Park, the supervisor, walked Morrison through the standard process, a briefing about evidence preservation, instructions to surrender her onboard duties temporarily, and a note that the airline would complete an internal investigation per its policies. He used procedural language to ease the moment. Those phrases are designed to sound neutral, but neutrality doesn't erase shame. A passenger later described Morrison's expression as a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension, an understanding that this one recorded interaction would be archived, parsed, and reconciled against company standards. Marcus watched unembellished. His role had not been to humiliate an individual, but to test whether a frontline encounter would be treated, under contract, as a systemic risk. He felt the human consequences as keenly as anyone in the cabin. He also knew that transforming systems often required documentation and the courage to let institutions follow the rules they had negotiated. After ensuring Janet Rodriguez at Williams Aviation Consulting had the live clips and the timestamps, Marcus closed his laptop and put his phone away. He had started a process. The institution would now have to follow it. Within hours of landing, the story left the metal skin of that particular plane and entered a wider set of rooms: the airline's internal compliance unit, Williams Aviation Consulting's audit team, inboxes at PR firms, feeds on social platforms, and, in a matter of days, editorial desks. The airline's communications team released a measured statement, an acknowledgement of the incident, an apology for any passenger distress, and a promise of an investigation and corrective steps. The language was careful. The headline-grabbing phrase, "suspended pending investigation," did the work that spokespeople had rehearsed for years. It signaled action without prejudgment. Minutes had become a legal and reputational hinge. In the following days, the hinge would swing wide. Marcus filed his formal audit report with Williams Aviation Consulting's compliance unit. The report included multi-angle video, time-stamped audio, and Marcus's written account of the interaction. It referenced the contract sections relevant to service equity and requested that the airline's compliance team open an investigation under the agreed protocol. Janet Rodriguez coordinated the transfer of evidence and confirmed with the station manager that the company would preserve all relevant materials. Inside the airline, the internal investigation followed a familiar choreography. Evidence preservation, archiving video from passengers, retrieving free statements, and documenting a timeline, was followed by interviews with on-duty staff and a review of Morrison's personnel record. The airline's legal team took a cautious tone: collect, preserve, avoid premature statements. But the contractual mechanism Marcus had invoked left little room for ambiguity. The company had agreed, under Section 12C and Section 15-like clauses in its maintenance and service partnership, that documented service equity violations arising during audited spot checks would trigger specified remedial pathways.
The remedial pathway the compliance team proposed was clear and, for some, purposeful: a suspension pending the outcome of the investigation, a mandatory intensive training program if the findings corroborated the audit, and the publication of a remediation plan outlining steps toward improved verification procedures and policy changes. Those steps were not merely punitive, they were procedural, designed to convert a bad interaction into institutional learning. In public, Patricia Hayes, the airline CEO, moved delicately. Her early external messaging avoided grandstanding. Internally, she convened a task force that included compliance, operations, HR, and public affairs. The aim was to respond in ways that would satisfy regulators and public opinion while safeguarding fair internal processes. The company committed to a transparent timeline for the investigation and promised that any corrective actions required by the contract would be taken. The language was not theatrical. It was a corporate translation of accountability into steps. Meanwhile, the social media storm did what it always does. It amplified nuance into certainty, and then demanded action. Reports that the live stream had amassed tens of thousands of viewers in the first few minutes recirculated in news feeds and corporate dashboards. Those counts were reported and not yet independently verified, but they functioned as metrics of urgency for executives who were watching public attention escalate. Hashtags multiplied, and in the days after, so did op-eds debating the interplay between individual culpability and institutional culture. For Morrison, the days that followed were the beginning of a difficult inward turn.
She requested to meet with the compliance team and with a mediator. She wanted context, and she wanted to tell her side, that she had thought she was enforcing class policy, that she had felt the pressure of a gate, that she had misread a situation she now saw differently. The company gave her the standard employee support, a paid suspension, access to counseling, and an invitation to participate in a remedial training program. They also gave her something harder to accept: access to the raw footage. That is a particular shape of accountability, seeing one's own actions through multiple lenses. Dr. Amamira Johnson became the architect of the program Morrison joined. Dr. Johnson is a practitioner scholar, a sociologist with a consulting practice focused on service equity and bias mitigation in frontline environments. Her approach, as she later described in interviews about the program's design, combined cognitive retraining, situational role-play, empathy-building exercises, and structural policy review. The training Morrison would complete was intensive by design, 40 hours across several weeks, a curriculum that mixed in-person workshops and remote coaching with measurable learning objectives. The first module began with reflection. Morrison watched the viral clips of the cabin interaction, not as a detached observer, but as the person in the clip. Seeing herself through dozens of different phones and angles did what raw feedback often does. It collapsed defensiveness and made room for raw reaction. She wept during the playback. She apologized to colleagues and to passengers in small private meetings. That repentance, important as it was only the opening note. Dr. Johnson's method pressed harder: accountability plus skill building. Role-play exercises followed, in which Morrison reenacted the interaction with clinicians and actors playing different passenger profiles. She learned techniques for verifying boarding without assumptions, for using neutral language under pressure, and for double-checking instead of relying on immediate social cues about who belongs in a space. The training included legal and policy refreshers, how to document, what the company expects, and the precise steps for escalation. It also invited Morrison to meet passengers who had experienced discrimination on other flights, not to be shamed, but to understand the cumulative harm of similar encounters. Those meetings were quietly powerful. A woman who had once been asked to move to coach because staff assumed she was a non-revenue traveler spoke not with accusation, but with a measured account of how small humiliations accumulate. Morrison listened, sometimes with her head in her hands, sometimes with the raw defiance that comes with confronting the harm one has contributed to. For Morrison, the training was less a public confession than a long, incremental process of learning that her choices, even those that seemed routine, rippled outward.
Williams Aviation Consulting continued its audit follow-through in parallel. Marcus and Janet worked with the airline's compliance team to ensure the incident was formally integrated into the audit report and that corrective recommendations were specific and measurable. Clause language translated from legalese into discrete obligations. Introduce a secondary verification protocol to reduce reliance on appearance-based assumptions, mandate periodic bias awareness refreshers for frontline staff, and deploy a service equity monitor, a tech-enabled system that would log and anonymize passenger feedback, specifically relating to service equity, and generate data for compliance reviews. The service equity monitor concept, born from Marcus's audits, is both technological and cultural: an app-based reporting interface for passengers, an internal dashboard for compliance teams, and anonymized analytics that track trends across routes and crews. It was not a silver bullet. Marcus had long argued that tools must be tied to contractual remedies and to follow-up training to be effective.
The airline piloted the monitor on a small subset of flights as part of its remedial plan. Initial rollout focused on routes with higher passenger complaints about service equity and included a requirement that certain interactions flagged by the monitor would trigger a follow-up review within 72 hours. Publicly, the airline's communications team issued an update a week after the incident. Morrison had been suspended pending the completion of an internal investigation. The company affirmed that it would require remedial training if the findings corroborated the audit, and a service equity monitor pilot would begin on selected routes. The statement walked the tightrope between specificity and caution. It named the remedial actions without trying to predict outcomes or promise that one process would fix systemic bias overnight. Industry reactions were swift. Competing carriers watched closely, not merely for schadenfreude but for risk management lessons. Contracts between airlines and maintenance and audit partners are dense with operational dependencies. The idea that a service audit could trigger reputational exposure was not new, but seeing one play out in public made it real. Some airlines began to explore similar audit clauses in their agreements, uncertain whether the model of contract-backed service equity checks could scale, but curious about the way operational leverage translated into accountability. Regulators, too, noticed. While the FAA stayed clear of adjudicating social fairness, consumer protection bodies and aviation oversight entities flagged an interest in how airlines handle discrimination complaints and whether mandatory reporting and audits might become standard expectations.
For the airline, the pressure was not only public sentiment, but the creeping sense that industry norms were shifting. Shareholders, regulators, and passengers were part of a new accountability ecosystem. Metrics began to matter in a new way. The pilot for the Service Equity Monitor generated preliminary data that the airline described as promising, an uptick in timely passenger reports and quicker internal responses, and an initial reduction in repeat complaints on pilot routes. Those reductions were reported early and were to be validated through longer-term analysis. Marcus and Williams Aviation's team insisted on caution in interpreting short-term signals. Still, for the airline's leadership, the monitor offered a path from reactive reputation management to proactive risk mitigation, structured reporting, data-driven corrective measures, and transparent timelines. Morrison's disciplinary pathway continued to be formal and measured. After the investigation corroborated elements of Marcus's audit findings, the airline's HR and compliance teams decided on a route that combined accountability with rehabilitation, a suspension that included a return-to-work agreement, mandatory completion of the 40-hour program led by Dr. Johnson, ongoing performance monitoring, and a probationary period during which Morrison's interactions would be monitored for adherence to updated protocols. The decision was public in its effect, but private in its implementation, a balance the company favored to both demonstrate action and preserve an individual's opportunity to change. Months later, Morrison walked back onto a plane in uniform with a return-to-work coach at her side. The first flights were governed by a checklist that had been created as part of the remediation plan: ensure secondary verification when a situation was ambiguous, use neutral phrasing when asking for proof of seat assignment, and document any escalations immediately in an incident log that fed into the Service Equity Monitor. Those procedures were procedural and prescriptive. For Morrison, they were also lifelines, structures that both constrained and supported her new practice. Her colleagues, in many cases, responded with a mix of skepticism and guarded encouragement. Some long-timers grumbled about what they called over-documentation. Others, having watched the viral footage and the industry response, accepted that the job required new skills. The company invested in group workshops and micro-training modules that made the new protocols part of the everyday workflow rather than an admonishing afterthought. In time, Morrison became a case study inside the airline's internal learning forums. She participated in panels, first as a test case with visible vulnerability, then increasingly as a voice that could explain both the pressures of frontline service and the concrete steps that helped shift practice. Under Dr.
Johnson's guidance, Morrison assisted in role-play scenarios, offering first-hand insights into the triggers that had shaped her initial response. Her willingness to speak about the shame and the work of unlearning assumptions made her an awkward but effective trainer. That arc, public humiliation into disciplined remediation and then into public-facing leadership, is not a tidy redemption story. It is instead an example of a process some organizations aim for when they try to center accountability around corrective learning rather than only punishment. Morrison's colleagues later described moments in training when she moved from explaining her mistake to demonstrating a new technique for verifying identity without appeal to implicit cues. Those demonstrations were neither theatrical nor anointment. They were evidence of skill acquisition. For Marcus, the aftermath extended into formal analysis and public advocacy. Williams Aviation Consulting published a post-incident white paper, careful in tone, heavy in data, that outlined the incident as a case study in operational leverage. The report described the service equity audit framework, the contractual mechanisms that translated audit findings into remedial obligations, and the role of multi-source documentation in producing enforceable evidence. Marcus highlighted the importance of translating observed incidents into contractual triggers rather than ad hoc complaints. He argued that structural change requires both documentation and pre-agreed consequences. The white paper did not claim miraculous outcomes. It presented preliminary findings, increased reporting through the monitor, a measurable uptick in follow-up actions within the pilot routes, and an early reduction in repeat complaints on those routes, results labeled as preliminary and subject to longer-term validation. Marcus emphasized that audits are only tools. Their effectiveness depends on the integrity of follow-up, the fairness of internal processes, and the commitment to training and cultural change. Public reactions to the airline's choices varied. Some applauded the company for moving quickly and for choosing rehabilitation over fire-at-the-gate spectacle. Others criticized the airline for not doing more. Some commentators wanted immediate termination. Others urged deeper structural reforms across hiring, promotion, and staffing. The debate surfaced a familiar tension. Accountability can be swift, but systemic change is slow. The real test, analysts argued, would be whether the airline sustained investment in training, adjusted policies where necessary, and shared data transparently. Other airlines took notice. Contracts were re-examined in procurement and legal departments. Where could audit clauses ensure service equity? Could data from passenger monitoring systems be integrated into compliance dashboards?
Procurement teams negotiated with auditing firms and consultancies. HR departments updated training curricula. Legal teams reviewed the language of remedial obligations. The industry did not converge on a single model, but the notion that audits, paired with contractually obligated remedies, could be a lever for change, migrated from the margins into mainstream conversation. Back at the individual level, the story continued to have complex human ripples. Morrison's life did not become a neat arc of downfall and redemption overnight. There were lingering moments of shame, of passengers who remembered the viral clip, of colleagues who kept private distance. There were also small acts of repair. A passenger who recognized Morrison on a later flight and offered a brief, genuine smile. Another who sent an email to the airline praising the staff's improved verification. A colleague who asked Morrison to co-lead a micro-training module. Those small gestures do not erase harm. They simply indicate the unpredictable paths of reparation. Months later, the airline published a more formal report on its pilot service equity monitor. The document included preliminary reported metrics, an increase in timely incident capture, a reduction in repeat complaints on pilot routes, and faster remedial response times. The airline framed these numbers carefully, promising additional validation and external audits. For regulators and industry watchers, the pilots suggested a replicable architecture, data-driven reporting, contractual enforcement, and integrated training, though the scaling questions remained complex. Marcus continued to speak about the incident in business forums and at conferences, not as a triumphalist tale, but as an instructional case. He emphasized that the title that swirled on social feeds, "He fired the flight attendant in 6 minutes," was inaccurate as a literal description, but useful as a provocation. The literal truth was different and instructive. Documentation plus contractual leverage produced an immediate institutional response that included suspension and a pathway to remediation. He argued that the story's real power was not in a single moment of punitive spectacle, but in the activation of systems that translated a recorded encounter into enforceable organizational learning. Sarah Chen and the teenage girl who filmed the scene, two of the many bystanders whose phones became instruments of public record, later spoke about what it meant to see everyone's footage stitched together and then used in official procedures. They described a mix of surprised agency and the uneasy weight of being witnesses. Their recordings were credited in the audit packet. They did not sue, nor did they seek fame. They were part of the new ecosystem of civic documentation, a public that, sometimes, provides the raw inputs that institutions can use, if those institutions are willing to be compelled to act.
Over time, industry conversations shifted from whether to adopt auditing clauses to how to make them credible. A series of best practice guidelines emerged from consortia of consultancies, airlines, and consumer advocates. The recommendations emphasized careful evidence standards, multi-source recording, chain of custody preservation, and clear timelines for investigation. They also urged caution about relying solely on reactive measures. Structural investment in training and hiring practices was, they said, a non-negotiable complement to audit mechanisms. Within the airline, some of the changes were procedural: a secondary verification step for ambiguous seating disputes, updated scripts for flight attendants that emphasized neutral language and documentation, and mandatory periodic retraining tied to measurable outcomes on the Service Equity Monitor dashboard. The company's compliance team began to publish quarterly summaries of monitor metrics internally, and HR incorporated bias awareness modules into new hire training for cabin personnel. Jennifer Morrison's own arc became an internal example of the messy, human side of institutional accountability. She completed the 40-hour program, she re-entered service under a supervision plan, and in time she volunteered to co-facilitate training modules alongside Dr. Johnson. The company, observing her progress and the candor of her reflections, enlisted her in a pilot peer coaching initiative for frontline staff. Later still, Morrison accepted a formal role as a peer coach in the airline Service Excellence program, a position that was less a promotion than a repositioning, from a purely operational posture to one that intentionally prioritized people development. Her public statements were modest. In an internal memo she wrote, language intended for colleagues rather than headlines, Morrison acknowledged the harm, thanked her colleagues and trainers, and urged the company to continue investing in systems that prevent similar incidents. She did not seek absolution. She sought to make the work she had to do visible. Some employees found her presence in training emotionally fraught. Others found her practical guidance useful. Her experience illustrated a complicated doctrine. Institutions can both hold individuals accountable and provide pathways to rebuild competence and trust. In the months and years following, the incident became a case study taught in compliance seminars, in HR workshops, and at conferences about corporate responsibility. Professors cited it when discussing how modern documentation reshapes accountability. Compliance officers used it to illustrate the leverage that contractual language can provide. Activists debated whether contractual mechanisms were sufficient or whether legal and regulatory measures should also be strengthened.
The conversation was ultimately plural. No single actor had the final word, and the incident was a prompt for iterative adjustments across many institutions. For passengers and viewers who had watched the viral footage unfold in those first minutes, the lasting lesson was both practical and moral. Phones had moved from tools of distraction to tools of public record. Contracts, often seen as technical and remote, had become instruments for enforcing standards of equity, and organizations that treated a recorded incident as an opportunity to learn rather than solely to punish tended in early pilots to produce more enduring behavioral change. Marcus returned to his work with a renewed emphasis on scalable remedies. He lectured about building contractual clauses that were clear, enforceable, and measurable. He argued for third-party verification of audits and for the integration of passenger-facing reporting tools into compliance routines. Marcus emphasized restraint. The point was not to weaponize audits for petty retribution, but to create predictable, enforceable pathways when documented incidents revealed patterns of bias. At a public forum months later, Patricia Hayes described the airline's posture in cautious terms. She said the company had acted within the contract, that it had chosen remedial training and process improvements as part of a broader plan, and that it would continue to refine its policies based on data from the monitor and independent auditors. The speech was measured, targeted at regulators, investors, and passengers. It reflected the new reality that reputational risk management is now entwined with public expectations about fairness. The teenage girl's clip, the raw pieces of consumer documentation, became a small archival artifact in those institutional conversations. It reminded participants that accountability often begins with a single act of witnessing. That witnessing alone does not produce systemic change. Only when coupled with enforceable obligations, transparent processes, and committed follow-through does an incident become the beginning of institutional reform. Years after that tense moment in the cabin, the airline reported that complaint patterns had shifted on routes where the Service Equity Monitor was piloted. The company framed these shifts as early, reported indicators of improvement and pledged ongoing independent validation. Other carriers experimented with similar reporting systems and enhanced training. For advocates of structural accountability, the incident had shown both a replicable architecture and the hard limits of immediate transformation. Cultures change slowly, and technology and contracts are only part of the solution. And what of the people at the center? Marcus remained a cautious advocate for structural approaches. He continued publishing analyses and advising boards on how to translate ordinary passenger experiences into enforceable standards.
Jennifer Morrison kept working, sometimes in the cabin, sometimes in training rooms. She became an uncomfortable, earnest voice for better practice, neither erased by her mistake nor solely defined by it. Janet Rodriguez continued coordinating audits. Dr. Amamira Johnson expanded her practice, training more crews and refining curricula that fused cognitive science with operational constraints. Sarah Chen and the teenage girl returned to their daily lives with the knowledge that their phones had been instruments of civic record. The headline, "A A black CEO was denied a first-class seat. 6 minutes later, he fired the flight attendant. Remained clickable and simplified. But the fuller story was messier and in many ways more instructive. A recorded incident triggered contractual remedies that led to suspension pending investigation, mandated training, the design and pilot of a service equity monitor, and an industry conversation about how to make fairness both measurable and enforceable. If there is an enduring lesson, it is this: documentation matters, and so does the design of the systems that follow. A phone in a pocket can reveal a wrong, but it cannot by itself fix an institution. Contracts, compliance processes, and investments in human learning are the next steps, the mechanics that turn visible harm into organizational obligation and potentially into change. On flights now, some crews move with a different rhythm: a quiet verification step, a neutral question, a captured incident logged into a tablet that feeds an internal dashboard. These procedural changes are small. Their cumulative effect is what matters. When a recorded encounter becomes evidence in a formal audit, it becomes part of an enforceable record, an input to training, an item on a compliance checklist, and sometimes a catalyst for broader industry adoption. This was not a story of instant retribution. It was a story of documentation, leverage, institutional response, and the slow, difficult work of converting a viral moment into policy and practice. It was also a human story of error, shame, and for some, repair. If you witnessed or were affected by an encounter like this, consider documenting it and reporting it through official channels. Preserve evidence, note timestamps, and share details with the relevant compliance or consumer protection offices. Share this video with someone who needs to see how modern accountability can work, and comment below with your experiences. What changes have you seen, and what would you like institutions to do better? The cabin's hum, once a background cadence to a single moment in time, has become part of an ongoing conversation about who belongs where and how institutions respond when someone says otherwise. The phones did their part, the contracts and people did theirs. The work continues.